body then than Claptoot. Think of the number of people who have been put in this position over the years of having to propose a toast of the immortal memory of Robert Burns. Some of them I know for a fact who don't know the first thing about Burns. And one such gentleman rushed up to the local library, went into the wee lassie at the front desk, and he says, "Robert Burns, the complete works." She says, "Oh, you're in the wrong place, Mr. Burns, the massage parlour's across the road." We'll get the obligatory garden story out the road first, before we get down to I was driving into Aberdeen, got caught in a traffic jam, and whilst I was sitting there in the traffic jam, I saw these two guys at the side of the road. One of them was digging holes, and the other was filling them in. So I was a bit intrigued by this, so I drew in, went out, and I said, "Well, what's going on here, boys? You're digging holes, and you're filling them in." "Aye, well, my name's Wally, and I dig holes." The other boy says, "And my name's Tom, and I fill in holes." He says, "We usually work in three. Harry plants the trees, but he's more into this one." Do you ever stop to think the number of times this address has been prepared and delivered since the early 1800s? And that's happening across the globe. And while Scotland might have been diluted because of the numbers who have emigrated over the years, thoughts of home are never very far away. To digress slightly, I don't know whether you saw the interview with the injured soldier in Afghanistan. And the reporter says to him, he says, "Where were you hit?" "Oh," he says, "about 12 miles, the Kinbuck side of Baghdad." We're here tonight to honour a man who knows no equal in the range and subject matter of his legacy, coupled with the manner in which he expressed himself. So much of what he has left us is as pertinent today as it ever was. Each year we search for another angle on Robert's life to highlight, and we're indebted, of course, to the media, who were waking up in early January to rake through the Burns story, looking for another wee sensational tidbit, aided and abetted by academics who you might think would have made the day with their time. Last year we had the new sketch, allegedly, of the man himself, a caricature, a punchline character, a cartoon character, a manny with a belly and a double chin. In modern times, certainly no sex object. But hold on a minute. Every Lothario that ever was never right at George Clooney. The fact is that the man in the sketch was probably a man called Skiffing, who was a contemporary of Ross. Then there was this story, of course, about him being encouraged to write more political stuff by William Wordsworth and his Bohemian friends. This from some professor of trivial pursuits at the University of Bacabillon, a fellow of the Institute of Hee-Haw. Wordsworth wasn't born until 1770. By the time he was an adolescent, Rab was well ahead of the game, long before they ever came to the fore. Rab would have gone to the West Indies in a fit of desperation and depression as James Armour, his would-be father-in-law, was about to set the law on him. His mind was in a turmoil. He was desperately poor, and he concerned that he could not meet his commitments. He was referred to at one time as the farmer who sowed his oats and prayed for a crop failure. He was beset with the problem of having poor land, and the family, big numbers of family, they would overcome the problems, but it was never, ever going to happen, was it? I heard a nice story the other day about the old bachelor farm servant who'd lived in the Bothie Oys days. He had to go into the hospital for an operation for appendicitis. He's lying there in the bed, and this woman approached with a trolley and a steaming bowl of hot water. He says, "What are you going to do?" She says, "I'm going to give you a bed bath." He says, "Oh, what does that entail?" Well, the last woman that had ever been as intimate with him was his mother. So he got all steamed up about this. He says, "Well," he says, I see what you mean, he says, but do you mind I'll manage to do the rope run myself? As we know, Robert didn't go to the West Indies. With the success of the Kilmarnock edition of his poems, the opportunity for further success, he headed for Edinburgh. I should say that my family come from Kilmarnock. I was born and brought up there and was sort of got a clout in the lug for running over John Wilson's grave in the old kirkyard. And something that Alec maybe doesn't know is that our auntie married John Burns, and their firstborn was Robert Burns. And in 1953, when he came home from the army, he set up a market garden in Alloway. So in 1953, there was a Robert Burns growing stuff in a market garden in Alloway, and it was a cousin of ours. He found sense, of course. He went away and became a very rich oil executive. and while we mention that, our other cousin, Jim McColl, is the one that's got all the millions. Another part of the same family. Anyway, everybody and his auntie knows that Robert fathered 13 bairns. He wrote bawdy poems, and he enjoyed a night out with the boys. Nevertheless, I can guarantee till kingdom come, some other juicy morsel will be unearthed and invented, or to be chewed over by the academics. And do you think the thousands that are celebrating gives a monkeys? I doubt it, because any publicity is good publicity. I heard the story about the chap who had a bit of an affair with an Italian lady, and she became pregnant. So they decided, or she decided, that she would go back to Italy to have the child. And like Robert, he wanted to be able to look after the child, take responsibility for his actions. He says, how will I know when the baby arrives? She says, I'll send you a postcard and all I'll put on it is spaghetti. And you'll know, and if you wish to send me some sustenance and so on, that'll be fine. So in 9 months' time, postcard arrived, and as luck would have it, he wasn't there when it arrived, his wife got it. So he arrives at night and she says, there's a funny postcard arrived for you tonight. She says, with a strange message on it. He says, what is it? It says, spaghetti, 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 3 with meatballs and 2 without. Please send more sauce. Plumbing the debts, opposite young ex here. There's the story of the child support agency. That's another thing. They wouldn't have to spend obscene amounts of money trying to find Robert. He took responsibility for all that he did. So this wifey is in this child support agency looking for money. And they said, well, unless you can tell us the name of the father, we can't support you. You must tell us the name of the father of the child. She says, look, she says, if you eat a tin of beans, can you pick out the one that makes you fart? The way Scots crave nostalgia is Burns simply an excuse. It was G.K. Chesterton who said, the true Scot is a sentimentalist, but he has difficulty in keeping the secret. That may be the truth, but I have a different slant on this. Robert Burns is an important pillar in the edifice that is the personality of Scotland. And it serves to emphasise our individuality, and we should never lose sight of that. The Scot has never been supple at the knee, and who better to remind us of that than Rab Mosgiel? Because nothing, absolutely nothing can change the legacy of Robert Burns. It's there in black and white for all to see. We are uplifted by it, comforted, inspired, excited, and entertained by it. He was no saint, and I am certainly no apologist. Have you ever heard of a Shakespeare supper? Or a Keats, or a Shelley, or a Milton, or a Chaucer supper? Those of you who might be listeners to Radio Scotland the Saturday morning a couple of weeks ago, Mark Stephen and his chums, specialising on the whole Burns thing, and he reminded of that famous popular quiz question. Which literary person worldwide has the most number of statues raised in their memory? I don't need to tell you in the context of tonight. There are 180 statues of Robert Burns around, and I'm sure that says it. all. But the old song says, it's not what they say, it's the way that they say it. So how's about this? I want a floating duck house. I want to clear my moat. I need to mend my tennis court. That's why I need your boat. I have to build a portico. My swimming pool needs mending. My lovely plants need horse manure, and the agar needs much tending. A chandelier is vital. Mock tudor boards are great. My hanging baskets won awards, and I've earned a tax rebate. I need a glitter toilet seat. My piano so needs tuning. Maltesers help me stay away, and my orchard must need pruning. I could have said the rules were wrong, and I often thought I should, but somehow it was easier to profit all I could. The public really have to see that the rules are there to test, and by defrauding taxpayers, we were just doing our best. The Speaker of the House is gone, our sacrificial beast, but the public are still braying for our corpses at the feast. What do the public want from us? Those vote-wielding ingrates. They really should be grateful to be financing our estates. The message is so very clear. We're merely learning late that the British way of living well is to screw the bloody state. Many people have the ability to pen a few lines which, when heard in context, can be apt, touching, moving, frequently quite entertaining, but the likelihood is that they will soon be forgotten. We, in 2009, are celebrating the 251st anniversary of Robert Burns's birth, and we know that he will be and is still being remembered, revered and lauded in every corner of the globe by Scots, by those descended from Scots, and just as many who have no family links with this land. Many of Burns's sentiments are often thought, but ne'er so well expressed. Revered from Auckland to Murmansk, from Terbolt to Tokyo, this man's work includes songs, poetry, letters and dissertations, all of which endure. And what's more, though not so well known, these letters and journalistic pieces gives a very acutely observed picture of life and the society he lived in, which can all be backed up, of course, with historical fact. There are, and still are, critics who will argue that Burns was not all that original. He was certainly influenced by others, for he was a great reader, and he had a fantastic memory. He was a collector of quotes. The scholars go to town on him. Some say that the Cotter's Saturday Night is plagiarised Gray's elegy, words written in a country churchyard. Well, in my wee Burns book, which I still have, and which I was presented with in 1948 at the Grange School in Kilmarnock for reciting Te Amoose, the heading to the Cotter's Saturday Night is the first verse of Gray's elegy. Of course, Burns knew Gray's elegy, because it was printed and it was available in Glasgow in 1765. But in my humble view, using a modern parallel, whilst Gray of the elegy was writing about people who were dead and the opportunities they might have missed in their lifetime, it was from a seat on the terracing as a spectator. Robert Burns was on the pitch. He was the player. He was in the Cotter's house, and following the death of his father, he was the central figure in that scene. Let's face it, there are examples of character defects throughout history to suggest that the next word to genius on the human genome is the word aberration. Good at one thing, genius at one thing, but perhaps an aberration. We could mention Tiger Woods in the passing. There's a classic example. That has had its repercussions. The guy went home the other night and his wife was packing her bag. He says, "Where are you going?" She says, "I'm going to London. I understand that I can earn £1,000 a night for a night of passion." "Oh, really?" He says. Well, about half an hour later, she went to see where he was. He was packing his bag as well. She says, "Where are you?" He says, "I'm going to London." "What are you going to London for?" He says, "I want to see how you're going to manage on £2,000 a year." Story told of the old man and the young wife, and he was having a wee bit difficulty keeping it up, if you'll pardon the expression. So he went to the doctor and he asked for Viagra. And And the doctor said, no, I don't think it'd be worthwhile. That's what, like putting a new flagpole in a derelict building. But Burns recognised his failings, and in his own way, he did have an answer for those who would have censured him. In his address to the uncongregate, he pens these telling lines. Then gently scan your brother man, still gentler sister woman. Though they may gang a ken and rhyme, to step aside is human. Not an excuse, a telling observation. And it reminds me of a piece I read about the composer Beethoven, who, despite being deaf, left an amazing legacy of magnificent music. Yet he was criticised too, for he was an alcoholic. What more would we expect from Mr. Beethoven? Is the inference that if he hadn't been an alcoholic, we might have got a 10th, or even an 11th symphony? The fact is, we might never have got any, but for the opium of alcohol. Unfortunately, Beethoven too was human. Think what a tortured, destructive soul Robert Burns might have been if he hadn't been able to put his thoughts and ideas, his feelings and emotions down on paper. No wonder he had great admiration for his father, who made sure that he had an education of sorts. We've come to know it as block release, haven't we, from day release, because they only allowed him off the farm when he wasn't needed to work on the farm. So he would get educated for a week at a time, and then he had to get back because his father was needing him. My father was a farmer upon the Carrick border. Carefully he bred me in decency and order. He bade me act a manly part, though I had ne'er a farthing. For without an honest, manly heart, no man was worth regarding. Burns poured out a torrent of humour, satire, political argument, social comment, allegory, love, the likes of which has never been seen from the pen of one person. That is why we remember and acknowledge his genius around this anniversary of his birth on the 25th of January. All against a background of poverty, privation and ill health, plagued by, and this sometimes doesn't go down too well, but in this context I think it will, plagued by twin curses, barren soil and fertile women. He didn't have a problem with drink, though he enjoyed the ambience of the bar, when no doubt stories were told and new ballads written. Had a nice story about a chap who was a wee bit worried the way or the other. He was making his way home along the river bank, and he came on a Baptist ceremony with total immersion. You know the business of the Baptist church, total immersion. It was taking place on the river bank. So he stood watching it, and the minister looked up and said, "Next," and he stumbled into the water. And the minister grabbed him by the shoulders and dunked his feet down, and up he came. He says, "Now, my son," he says, "have you seen Jesus?" He says, "No." So he dunked him down again, and up he came. He says, "Have you seen Jesus?" He says, "No." So the third time when the minister was getting a wee bit fed up with him, he obviously hadn't been listening to the classes. The fact is he'd never been to any. So he dunked him down, he held him down a while, and then he got up and he was sputtering and gasping for breath. He says, "Have you seen Jesus?" He says, "No." He says, "Are you sure this is where he fell in?" The story about somebody who's inebriated is from Glasgow. You may remember, as it turns out, purely coincidental, you may remember the great Baptist missionary from America called Billy Graham. And he was in Glasgow for a big campaign. His taxi to take him back to the hotel at night didn't arrive, so he jumped on a number 12 bus. He's sitting in the bus when one Glasgow inebriate sat down beside him. I don't know whether you've any experience of them. They're usually built like a brick house. And they will talk to you, whether you want them to talk to you or not. They will again. "Oh," says, "good evening," said the stately Mr. Graham. "What do you do for a living?" He says, "I'm a minister." "Oh, well, I let that run about his brain for a wee minute or two." He says, are you a Proddy?" He says, "I'm a Baptist minister." "Oh, yes, what's that mean?" He says, "Back home in my home country," he says, "they call me a Duncan pastor." He says, "You me both, pal." Robert certainly had problems with the some of them spiritual excitement, and of course it was their hypocrisy that he railed against in Holy Willie's prayer, and I'm delighted with it later. I like the story of the old shepherd who being rebuked by the minister being absent from his pew on the Sunday morning. Well, I was at Mr. Doig's kirk last Sunday, he says. And the minister said, well, I'm not sure that I like this running away to another kirk. How would you feel if your sheep were to stray onto another hill? He says, I wouldn't give you a doken if it was better grass. Grass. Grass is an Aberdeenshire phrase. People think I talk about no way. As I said earlier, Robert headed for Edinburgh to parade his newfound notoriety, publicise further editions of his work. He was feted by the great and the good. Every hostess in town would have had the Ayrshire poet at the dinner table, and you can take that one away you like. In today's society, his photo would probably be all over Hello magazine. I'm reminded of the story of the couple that were at a medical conference in Edinburgh, and they got rather friendly and they got quite close, and eventually they went for a meal together, and they decided to spend the night together. And the following morning, she's getting ready for going out, and he's lying in bed watching every move, and he says, I guess that you, part of medicine that you follow, and you're a surgeon. She says, you're right, how did you know? Well, he says, you're so methodical. He says, even in our passion last night, you made sure that everything was all set out ready for the morning. And this. He says, would you have guessed what part of the profession I'm involved? Oh, yes, she says, I can't find you're an anaesthetist. Two people meet in an aeroplane or in a business class, sitting next to one, man and woman, never known each other before. And they weren't in the plane for very long when she grabbed a handkerchief out and put it up to her nose, and she sneezed, and she went into sort of rigors, you know, and she was shaking all over. He was quite worried, and a wee while later, it happened again, same kind of thing. And a wee while later, it happened again. And he says, are you all right with you? She says, yes. She says, I've got a very unusual complaint. Every time I sneeze, I have an orgasm. He says, really? He says, are you taking anything for it? She says, aye, pepper. In recent times, it has been suggested that there was a cunning plot to keep Robert in Edinburgh, to discredit him because of his fiery nationalism and republicanism. This nonsense about brothers be for all that was a dangerous thing for those in power. It's claimed that the whole plot was the idea of Henry Dundas, a very powerful agent of Pitt the Younger, the Prime Minister in London. He would have been the equivalent of the Secretary of State for Scotland. These were difficult times, of course, for politicians, because the 45 rebellion wasn't far behind them. There were still people alive who had experienced it. The 7 Years' War was 56 to 63, the American War of Independence 78-82, the French Revolution 1890-99. Politicians and power brokers were a wee bit nervy because society was breaking down as the masses were beginning to say, we've had enough. Robert eventually, of course, returned to the farm, but he was still writing these essays under an assumed name because he was perhaps playing a dangerous game, because eventually, of course, he was to become an excise officer, being paid for by the state. And he didn't abandon his writing, and of course he certainly didn't abandon the other side of his character, the love songs, A Fond Kiss, the Bonnie Lansford Ballad, My Love Is Like a Red, Red Rose, John Anders, My Joe, and so on. His way with words was magical, but he remains the Plumman poet, an uncultivated genius. That said, Maria Riddle, in her short memoir, she was at Friars Cars, and indeed that letter that was recently publicised, having been found in New York, that Mrs. Burns wrote after Burns' death, was to the said Maria Riddle. She said, evenness of conduct and a due regard to the decorum of the world have been so rarely seen to live hand in hand with genius. But it's only the gems that show the dust. The pebble may be soiled and we do not regard it. Robert's sentiments, as expressed in A Man's a Man, are as relevant today as when they were written. When we consider the state of our society today, his words should haunt us. The philosopher writes, when the shoe fits, the foot is forgotten. When the belt fits, the belly is forgotten. When the heart is right, for and against are forgotten. Robert Burns said it much more succinctly. The hair side, the pair type, that marks us right or right. Gentlemen, please rise with me. Those in the immortal memory of Robert Burns.
Not much I can say to that, but excellent